On November the 3rd, 1872, a man named George Smith sat in the back room of the British Museum, hunched over a broken clay tablet no bigger than a man's hand. He was not a professor. He was not an archaeologist. He was a banknote engraver, a craftsman who carved fine lines into copper plates for a living. But he had taught himself to read cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script of ancient Mesopotamia, and the museum had hired him to sort through thousands of clay fragments brought back from the ruins of Nineveh. And on that November afternoon, as he carefully translated the tiny wedge marks, George Smith read something that made him jump out of his chair. According to witnesses, he began running around the room in excitement. One account says he started undressing, pulling off his clothes in a fit of scholarly ecstasy that must have alarmed his colleagues considerably. What he had found was a flood story. Not just any flood story, a flood story that was older than the Bible. The tablet described a man warned by a god that a great flood was coming to destroy all of humanity. The man was told to build a boat. He was told to take animals aboard. The flood came. The waters covered the earth. The boat came to rest on a mountain. The man sent out a bird to test whether the waters had receded. Every detail, every beat. The story was almost identical to Genesis chapters 6 through 9, the story of Noah. But this tablet was written at least 1,000 years before the book of Genesis was composed. And the man in the story was not called Noah. He was called Utnapishtim. George Smith published his discovery in December 1872, and the reaction was volcanic. The Daily Telegraph newspaper was so eager for more that they funded an expedition to Nineveh, and Smith himself led it. On his very first day of digging, he found another fragment of the same tablet. The odds of that happening by chance are so small that some scholars have questioned whether it actually happened that way. But the discovery was real, and it raised a question that scholars, theologians, and archaeologists have been fighting over for more than 150 years. Was the story of Noah's flood borrowed from an older Mesopotamian myth? Or do both stories point back to a real event, a catastrophic flood so devastating that every civilization in the ancient world remembered it? Stay with me, because the evidence is more surprising than either side wants to admit. To answer this question, you have to go back further than Genesis. You have to go back further than Utnapishtim. You have to go all the way to Sumer, the oldest civilization in recorded history, and a king named Ziusudra. The Sumerian king list is one of the most extraordinary documents in the ancient world. It is a list of kings who ruled Mesopotamia, and it divides all of history into two eras, before the flood and after the flood. Before the flood, the kings ruled for impossible lengths of time. One king ruled for 43,200 years, another for 36,000. Then, the list says simply, the flood swept over. After the flood, the reigns become shorter, more human, more believable. The Sumerian king list treats the flood as the single dividing line in all of human history, the moment everything changed. Ziusudra is the flood hero in the Sumerian version. The story, preserved on a tablet from around 1600 BC, but describing events much older, tells of the gods deciding to destroy humanity. One god, Enki, warned Ziusudra. He built a boat. He survived. After 7 days and 7 nights of storm, the sun god appeared, and Ziusudra bowed before him. Then came the Akkadian version, the Atrahasis epic, written around 1700 BC. This version adds a crucial detail. The gods did not send the flood out of pure wrath. They sent it because humanity had become too noisy. The text literally says that humans had multiplied, and their noise kept the gods from sleeping. The chief god, Enlil, proposed the flood as a solution to divine insomnia. Compare that to Genesis. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. In the Bible, the reason for the flood is moral. In Mesopotamia, it is practical. The gods are annoyed. In Genesis, God is grieved. The Hebrew word is va-yinnachem. He was pained in his heart. That is not annoyance. That is a father watching his children destroy themselves. 3 flood stories: Sumerian, Akkadian, Hebrew. 3 different cultures, 3 different reasons, but the same catastrophe. Now here is where it gets strange. In 2014, Irving Finkel, the curator of cuneiform at the British Museum, a man with a magnificent long grey beard and an infectious enthusiasm for dead languages, announced that he had translated a new flood tablet. And this one contained instructions for building the ark. The tablet was brought to the museum by a man named Douglas Simmons, whose father had acquired it in the Middle East sometime after the Second World War. The tablet was small, damaged, and written in Old Babylonian cuneiform, dating to around 1750 BC, making it one of the oldest flood texts ever found. And the instructions were specific. The boat was not a traditional ship, it was round. A giant coracle, a circular vessel made of rope and waterproofed with bitumen. The dimensions given on the tablet would produce a vessel roughly 220 feet in diameter. Enormous, but physically possible. Finkel calculated that it would have been approximately the size of a football field. A round boat makes no engineering sense for sailing, but it makes perfect sense for surviving a flood. A coracle does not need to go anywhere. It needs to float. It needs to not capsize. And a circular vessel with a low center of gravity is remarkably stable in rough water. Finkel published his findings in a book called The Ark Before Noah, and it became a bestseller. He also appeared on television attempting to build a scale model of the round ark, which floated, though just barely. The biblical ark, described in Genesis 6, is different. It is rectangular, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. That translates to roughly 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Those proportions, a 6.1 length-to-width ratio, are remarkably close to the proportions used in modern cargo ships. Whoever wrote the specifications in Genesis was not describing a coracle. They were describing something that could move through water. If this is your first time here, you are watching Sacred Shadows. We go deep into the stories the Bible hides in plain sight. Hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and tell me in the comments, do you think Noah's flood was a real event? Now let me show you what the ground itself tells us. In 1929, a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley was digging at the ancient city of the city the Bible identifies as the birthplace of Abraham. Woolley had already made spectacular discoveries, the royal tombs of with their golden helmets and sacrifice servants, when his team hit something unexpected. Beneath the layers of ancient civilization, pottery, mud brick walls, broken tools, they found a thick layer of clean, sterile clay. No artifacts, no pottery, no bones, nothing. Just clay. deposited by water. The layer was 11 feet thick. Woolley stood at the bottom of his excavation pit and wrote in his notebook, "I got my workmen together and told them we had found the flood." He believed it. He believed he had found physical evidence of the biblical deluge. The layer was thick enough and clean enough to represent a catastrophic flood that had completely interrupted human settlement. But there were problems. The flood layer at Ur did not appear at the same depth or even the same date at other Mesopotamian sites. Similar layers were found at Kish, Shuruppak, and other cities, but they dated to different centuries. If the flood had been universal, you would expect the same layer everywhere at the same time. Instead, you got different floods at different times, consistent with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooding catastrophically, but locally, as rivers do. Most archaeologists today believe Woolley found evidence of a massive local flood, devastating, civilization disrupting, but not global. A flood so enormous that the survivors believed the entire world had been destroyed. In a world without maps, without satellites, without any way to know what lay beyond the horizon, a flood that covered everything you could see was, for all practical purposes, a flood that covered everything. Pay attention to this. In 1996, two marine geologists from Columbia University, William Ryan and Walter Pitman, published a theory that sent shockwaves through both the scientific and biblical communities. They proposed that around 5600 BC, the Mediterranean Sea had broken through a narrow land bridge at what is now the Bosphorus Strait, the channel that separates modern Turkey from Europe, and poured into the Black Sea basin. Before this event, the Black Sea was a much smaller, freshwater lake. The people living along its shores were farmers and fishermen. The breach would have sent 10 cubic miles of salt water per day crashing through the strait, 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls. The water level would have risen 6 inches per day. Within months, 60,000 square miles of coastal land would have been submerged. Ryan and Pitman argued that this was the flood that all the ancient stories remembered. The farming communities around the Black Sea would have been devastated. Survivors would have scattered in every direction, some toward Mesopotamia, carrying with them the memory of a world drowned by water. Over centuries, the story would have been retold, reshaped, and eventually written down as the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis, and Genesis. The theory received a massive boost in the year 2000 when Robert Ballard, the man who found the Titanic, led an expedition to the Black Sea floor. Using deep-sea submarines, his team found evidence of an ancient shoreline 400 feet below the current surface. They found preserved wooden structures. They found freshwater mollusks at depths where only saltwater species should exist. And they found what appeared to be the remains of a human settlement, buildings, tools, on the ancient lake floor. Ballard told National Geographic, "We went down and found the ancient shoreline. It was perfectly preserved, covered by sediment. And the pottery we found dated to approximately 5000 BC, right around the time the flood would have occurred." Not everyone is convinced. Some geologists argue the Black Sea transition was gradual, not catastrophic. Others point out that the dating does not perfectly align with the Mesopotamian flood traditions. The debate continues, but here is what most people miss. The argument about whether the flood was real often misses the point the Bible itself is making. Genesis is not a geology textbook. It is not trying to pass a peer review. The flood narrative in Genesis is making a theological claim, a claim about the character of God and the nature of human evil. Look at the structure. Before the flood, Genesis says that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Hebrew is emphatic, kol yetzer, makshevet libo rak ra, kol hayom. Every inclination, only evil, all the time. 5 words of total moral collapse, and God's response is not anger, it is grief. Va-yinnachem Adonai, the Lord was grieved. The word nacham carries the sense of sighing, of deep emotional pain. The creator of the universe looked at what his creation had become, and it broke his heart. That is not a weather report. That is a theological revolution. In every other ancient flood story, the gods destroy humanity for selfish reasons: noise, annoyance, overpopulation. In Genesis, God destroys because of moral evil. And even in the act of destruction, he provides a way out. He tells Noah to build the ark. He saves a family. He saves the animals. And when the waters recede, he makes a covenant, a promise sealed with a rainbow that he will never destroy the earth with water again. No Mesopotamian god makes a covenant. No Sumerian deity promises restraint. The rainbow in Genesis is not a weather phenomenon. It is a theological statement about a God who binds himself to a promise. You can debate the geology forever. You can argue about flood layers and sea level changes and cuneiform tablets until the end of time. But the Bible is asking a different question. Not did the water rise, but does God grieve when humanity falls? Not how big was the boat, but does God provide a way out when the world is drowning? So, was Noah's flood real? Here is what we know. First, flood stories appear in virtually every ancient civilization on Earth, not just Mesopotamia. The Greeks had Deucalion. The Hindus had Manu. Chinese tradition records a great flood survived by Gunyu. Native American traditions, from the Hopi to the Ojibwe, include flood narratives. Over 200 distinct flood myths have been documented across cultures that had no contact with each other. Something happened. The memory is too widespread to be coincidence. Second, the most likely physical candidate is a catastrophic regional event, possibly the Black Sea Deluge of 5600 BC, possibly a series of devastating Tigris-Euphrates floods, possibly a combination. The evidence does not support a global flood that covered every mountain on Earth, but it does support a flood so catastrophic that the people who survived it believed the entire world had been destroyed, because for them it had been. And third, this is the one I want you to carry with you. The power of the Noah story is not in the water level. It is in the covenant. Every culture that survived a great flood told a story about angry gods and helpless humans. Genesis told a different story, a story about a God who grieves, who saves, who makes promises, and who hangs a weapon of war in the sky, the bow, the rainbow, pointed away from the earth as a sign that judgment has been replaced by mercy. 200 flood stories across the ancient world, and only one of them ends with a promise. What do you think? Was the flood a literal global event, a catastrophic regional disaster that entered collective memory, or something else entirely? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this changed how you see the story of Noah, hit subscribe. We go deep into the stories the Bible hides in plain sight. Every week, a new mystery, a new revelation, a new reason to look again at the most extraordinary book ever written. I will see you in the next one.